And responding to harmful, inadequate supervision, hosted by the Supervision and Training section and the Practice Advisory Board. My name is Jenny Holzapfel, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Arizona State University. I'm joined by Nancy Gimbel, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Georgia. We are the student representatives for the Supervision and Training section and will be moderating this webinar. We are very excited to have Drs. Michael Ellis and Heidi Hutman with us to share their expertise in the area of harmful and inadequate supervision. Our goal is for this webinar to be an informal and productive discussion, so we'll start by having our speakers share some of their research and clinical expertise and then move into a discussion based on audience questions. A few technology notes before we begin. The chat feature for participants is disabled, so please submit any questions to the Q&A box. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be uploaded on the SCP YouTube channel within the next few days. We're putting the link to the YouTube channel in the chat. Much appreciation to Dr. Lisa Ferdinand and our current section chair and the rest of the STS board for their assistance in planning this webinar, and to Dr. Asmita Pense, our section webmaster and SCP webinar coordinator, for her behind-the-scenes webinar assistance and coordination today. I'm going to hand it off to Nancy now to introduce our speakers.
Hey everyone, welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers, Dr. Heidi Hutman, who uses the pronoun she, hers, is an assistant professor in the Counseling Psychology Master's program at Temple University. Originally from Montreal, Canada, she was a licensed professional counselor in the province of Quebec and is currently pursuing licensure as a psychologist in Pennsylvania. Dr. Hutman's research and teaching interests are in multicultural competency development, as well as clinical supervision and training. In particular, she's interested in how and to what extent supervisor multicultural competence and cultural humility and the relationship between supervisors and supervisees influence outcomes in supervision and training, as well as the relationships among supervision and therapy outcomes. Dr. Michael Ellis, who uses the pronouns he, his, New York State licensed psychologist who received his doctoral degree from the Ohio State University. Dr. Ellis has over 30 years of experience as a practitioner, clinical supervisor, and supervisor trainer. He has authored numerous articles, book chapters, and monographs on the topic of supervision and has served on several peer-reviewed journal editorial boards. He is a fellow of the American Psychological Association. Viewed through the lens of diversity, oppression, and privilege, his teaching and research interests include clinical supervision and supervisor training, and research methodology, psychometrics, and statistics. He's an internationally renowned expert in clinical supervision and is frequently called upon to conduct workshops for clinical supervisors, both nationally and internationally. We're very excited to have you both join us today to discuss this important topic. Now I'll turn it over to Dr. Ellis to kick off our session.
Thanks, Nancy. It is a pleasure for me to be here today. And I really appreciate you taking out time and spending yet more time on Zoom, as if our lives are not being consumed by that these days. Hopefully in the coming hour, we'll be able to provide some information for you and answer questions you might have. Recognizing that we've got a really large group, we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So I thought the way that I might start is for Heidi and I to talk about how do we get into this topic. And for me, it goes back quite a few years ago, in some ways starting in my internship and then carrying on after that. I had, as a new assistant professor, I had a lot of people coming up and knocking on my door, oftentimes in tears, talking about really horrific things that were happening to them in their clinical supervision experiences. More often than not, it was off-campus sites, practicum sites, and for master's students or internship sites. And for me, after about a dozen of those happening, it's like, there's nothing out here on this. I really need to understand this better. So that's what prompted me to get sort of initially going on this, and was part of a symposium that Mickey Friedlander put together at APA in 2000, I think it was in 2000, which I was a part of that. I think it was a discussant, and that sort of started my journey here that's led to some of the data and research I'll be presenting today. Some of that data we just collected in the last year, which just affirms those numbers. So I think I'll stop there, and actually two other things I want to say is, It was in my doctoral program that I really became and started growing my passion for clinical supervision. And it's something that matters to me a lot. It's something I'm very much enthusiastic about. I look forward to my supervision sessions when I'm training supervisors or training supervisees. It's always something I found to be very fulfilling to actually have a chance to make an impact in addition to the clinical work I do. So I think at that point, I'll stop and flip it over to Heidi to talk a little bit about her experiences.
Thanks, Mike. I'm also really excited to be here today and appreciate everybody who has made time to join us. I know that we all have a lot going on these days, and there is no shortage of Zoom opportunities. So for me, you know, I believe that research is me search. And similar to kind of what Mike was describing, when I started my master's program at McGill University in Montreal, and started my supervision experience as a supervisee, I became acutely aware of how much power the supervisor had over me to determine my, my academic standing, that I was dependent on them for reference letters, and to, eventually apply to a PhD. And unfortunately, I had some experiences that were really hard that led to clients being harmed, unfortunately, by supervisory inaction and supervisory just errors in terms of recommendations, and really pressuring me to respond to client issues in ways that didn't feel right to me, but I also didn't necessarily know if and how to use my voice to advocate for clients within the supervisory relationship. And I've always been somebody who tends to intellectualize, and so what I did was I threw myself into the literature, and that was very normalizing to realize that other supervisees were also struggling with some of the things that I was struggling with. And at the time, I came across a 2008 article that was based on a presentation Mike had given at the International Interdisciplinary Conference on Clinical Supervision. And I really found that a very normalizing and very powerful piece of literature. And so when looking into PhD programs, Mike was very much somebody I wanted to be able to be considered, in terms of working under him. I've really enjoyed being able to continue this research and really do research that has direct implications for how we work with supervisees and how do we create conditions that are conducive not only to their growth, but to their clients' welfare.
So I think it's cued back to me. So let me, for those who know me, to me, I always want to start with definitions. So the context that we're going to be presenting today, and sort of the view that we take, is one that's based upon competency-based clinical supervision. Perhaps Carol Fallander and Ed Shafransky are best known for this, both in their textbooks and their writings. If you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you to become familiar with it, because it is the major kind of shift that's happening, not just within psychology, but also worldwide and interdisciplinary. So I'll start with the definition. One of the definitions I like the most, this is from Bernard and Goodyear. If I had to personally recommend a text, I'd say start there. Carol and Ed's, the Fallander and Shafransky text would be another one I'd also encourage you to use. My style is to not read slides, so I'm going to leave these for you to read. I've tried to highlight here, or we've tried to highlight here, the things that seem most important and stand out to make a supervisory relationship unique from pretty much any other relationship you're going to have as a professional. The alternative definition is the one from that we developed in the APA task force when we came up with the guidelines for clinical supervision. So these are the ones for the psychologist in the group that really pertains to you, or for your psychology trainees. This is the definition really kind of for us in the field of psychology. I have to do this. Sorry, technology is what I wanted. So what I'd like you to do as a place to start is to pause for a moment. The assumption that we're making is that the vast majority, if not all of you, have had some kind of experience in clinical supervision, even if that were to be at this point just experiences in pre-practicum supervision. So I'd like you to take, and we're going to take literally 2 minutes here, to have you reflect upon your clinical supervision experiences. And in particular, I'd like you to identify and think about your best and your worst supervision experiences. And focus on what did the supervisor do and not do. So I'm going to give about 2 minutes of silence here for you to think this through. Both of those two scenarios, really step back into those experiences and see if you become clear about what it was that the supervisor was doing or not doing that made it best and made it worse. As you try to step back into these experiences, to the extent you can, try to anchor yourself in terms of feelings, thoughts, any sensations that were there, what it was like for you in terms of the general context and how it's affecting your life. And as you're trying to work through this, also kind of tune into how do your best and worst experiences affect the clients that you're working with and the treatment you're providing to them. So I'm going to shift gears now and come back and talk about the definition for minimally adequate supervision. For us to come up with an understanding of what is clinical, what is inadequate supervision, we need a place to start. At that point in time, APA did not have anything other than two things in the APA Ethics Code, which said that supervisors can have sex with their supervisees and we have to provide feedback. There was not much other guidance there. So we drew upon other disciplines, both in the United States and outside the United States, using a qualitative kind of consensus validation approach to come up with what was consistent across these disciplines in terms of the standards and ethical statements for clinical supervisors. These are the 11 that were there. Again, I'm not going to read through them. We will come back to these in a moment. So having this in place, then we sought about to come up with the definition of clinical supervision. And the definition you notice on the left here is predicated on Bernard and Goodyear. So we wanted to use what was at that point in time one of the most widely accepted definitions of supervision. There's over 24 the last time I checked. In the process of us doing the research on clinical supervision, we were looking at self-identified. In other words, we give a supervisee or you as a supervisee a definition of inadequate supervision and harmful supervision, and you would indicate, is the supervision I'm currently receiving inadequate or harmful? We also had a pool of over 50 supervisor behaviors and descriptors that we gave to a panel of, I think it was 38 experts in clinical supervision, and then had them rate to what extent this was adequate and for what extent each of the items was inadequate supervision. That is what we're calling de facto inadequate supervision here. We'll talk about de facto harmful in a moment. To reach that criteria on a scale of 1 to 7 from not at all to totally, they had to be hitting a score of 6 or higher for us to count it as a definitional inadequate supervision. So I'd like you to take a moment and reflect on those two, your best and worst supervision. To what extent did either one of those actually meet these definitional criteria? Chances are the worst situation would probably be the one easier. But also think about your best supervision. Did it adhere to these criteria? One way of thinking about it is, it is failing to do any one of these. So if your supervisor was not doing every one of the 11 things listed here, then that would be by definition, in terms of the taxonomy we developed empirically, inadequate supervision. So that's in part what we're asking you to do is when you think about your experiences, to what extent actually have they been inadequate and harmful? Some examples of what is in the de facto criteria for inadequate supervision. You can see several of these here. There are 19. There's just a few of those. But to give you some idea of what constitutes inadequate supervision, the part that was a surprise for us, we thought unethical supervision would be considered to be harmful. It was pretty consistent across all the experts is that no, that's inadequate supervision. So if your supervisor is doing something that's unethical, by definition, it's inadequate.
One of the things that I wanted to just kind of elaborate on is oftentimes supervisors are not necessarily even aware that they're providing inadequate supervision. So one of the things that we get a lot of questions about is kind of the use of an informed consent or a contract, for example. So, you know, in thinking about your own experiences and reflecting, as Mike asked you to do a couple of minutes ago, that might be something that you didn't think about as an example of an inadequate supervision experience, simply because your supervisor didn't know that that was something to do and you didn't know that to do. We only have as much knowledge as you know, as we're given in our training. And so you know, if our supervisors weren't trained to use a contract, it's likely that you might not be using a contract, and you know, might not have realized that that was a failure to meet minimally adequate supervision.
Go ahead, Heidi. I'll let you jump into the harmful part too. Give you a chance to participate here.
Thanks, Mike. All right, so you gonna turn the slides? Thank you. So harmful supervision is really distinguished from, related to, and we'll talk about the relationship between harmful and inadequate shortly, but harmful supervision is really about the psychological, emotional, and or physical harm or trauma to the supervisee. So it has to be something that caused harm or trauma. So there's an impact piece here. Supervisors who are acting inappropriately or maliciously, or supervisor negligence is certainly part of a harmful supervision experience. And the two essential components really are this idea that the supervisee was harmed in some way and that the supervisor behavior was known to cause harm. So it's well understood that these are harmful behaviors, and that by, you know, indirect kind of consequence that clients might be harmed as well. So in thinking about an example that came up for me in my master's program, I had a supervisor who worked very exclusively in practice with dissociative identity disorder. And so when I had a client who came and was experiencing early symptoms of psychosis, she kept telling me that I didn't understand the framework and that this was really DID. And I didn't navigate that as a master's level trainee who wanted to go on to a PhD, reference letters and all of these pieces. And so I kept coming back to her and saying, like, you know, when I sit with the client, it just doesn't feel like it fits for me. And she said, you're just not getting the framework. And so later on, this client actually ended up to be hospitalized for psychosis and missed a year of her education because, and so that to me is of how that behavior from a supervisor could lead to pretty significant client harm, while also recognizing that as supervisees, we're in really complicated situations and positions in terms of how to advocate for our clients while also protecting ourselves in the process. Next slide.
Sorry.
Okay, so you know, as I was kind of alluding to, the research really supports that harmful supervision is by definition inadequate supervision. That is, harmful supervision is subsumed by inadequate supervision. What we're really finding in the literature is that inadequate occurs along a continuum, and there's almost a threshold that gets passed where inadequate supervision, when it becomes harmful to the supervisee, then becomes harmful supervision. But all of that is kind of along a continuum of inadequate supervision behavior.
So pause for a moment and think about your experiences that we've been talking about your best and worst, and my guess is the worst supervision experience. To what extent did it meet criteria for harmful supervision?
Mm-hmm. You might also think about how you might have thought about it as adequate criteria, but then in hearing about the added layer of harmful supervision, maybe now you're saying, oh, well, this was actually quite harmful. Maybe it passes that threshold. And that's an experience that is kind of held up in the literature as well as in our own experiences, both personally as well as from hearing from various supervisees who have lived and inadequate supervision. So in terms of the kind of de facto examples, and when we say de facto, that's just a really fancy way of saying objective, behaviorally based criteria for supervision. So these are not rooted in supervisee perceptions of what they experienced, based on the panel of experts who came together and achieved consensus on behaviors that are observable and that were kind of, you know, agreed upon as clearly harmful. And so some of these things, you know, I would hope are not surprising, although unfortunately I know that both Mike and I have been heartbroken in hearing people's stories time again, things that, you know, you would hope to never hear about in the context of training. My supervisor groped me. I never said anything. I needed to get the letter to go on to my next job. Sometimes even like I know that supervisor supervises. So it gets really, really in terms of kind of complex trauma, really, really messy in that way. So definitely a lot of kind of exploitation, a lot of inappropriate behavior, very egregious ethically and professionally egregious behaviors that kind of really supervisor problems of professional competence in ways that are just downright harmful.
So what we thought we'd do is move here to research that we've been doing on clinical supervision for the past 20 years or so. The data I'm about to present is across 4 different studies, cumulative of over 1,200 supervisees at this point. These supervisees come from psychology, mental health counseling, social work, marriage and family therapy, substance abuse. I mean, there's a pretty wide range. And I think about 20% are international. Most of this is the United States though. So the numbers that, if you have not seen this before, usually the response I get is, oh, those numbers just can't be real. They're not accurate. I can assure you that they are, and they're probably underestimates given some of the data we have available to us. So in terms of the occurrence of inadequate supervision, so again, we had self-identified and de facto. Might have you pause for a moment and have you kind of think about would you be your guess in terms of how much, in terms of assessing individuals at one slice in time, what percentage are currently receiving inadequate supervision and what percentage are de facto, in other words, based upon what the supervisor is actually doing, receiving inadequate supervision. See how you compare. My guess is your numbers weren't this high. The inadequate supervision with current supervisor is combining the self-identified plus the de facto. We also ask questions about to what extent they have been harmed in the past. And when you see those numbers, I think you find them staggering. At least we still do. So let's change and let's take a look at harmful supervision. Again, think about if you were given a definition of harmful supervision, like we provided you a moment ago, to what extent would you identify any of the supervision you received as being harmful? So think about slice across time. At this point, how many people would we guesstimate to be currently receiving harmful supervision, self-identified versus based upon the supervisor's behaviors? Again, this is based upon the ratings of the supervisee that their supervisors engaging in this from not at all to totally describes the behavior. So it had to be greater than a 4. In other words, more than halfway across the scale that their supervisors doing this. Oh, and that was actually, yeah. So sorry, my dual screen setup is not working well for me right now. Try this again. So notice that 6 to 12%. Again, I'll fill in the rest of this here, just so you see these numbers. And I'll actually take a moment to let those numbers settle in, especially in terms of how many are currently receiving harmful supervision. Remember, this is 4 different studies across 4 different sets in time. We also, though we're not presenting in our presentation today, we also have a definition for exceptional supervision and criteria for that. When you look at those numbers, you notice that they drop down considerably. And the important piece here is that understand that exceptional supervision can only be exceptional supervision if it is adequate. So because there's so much inadequate supervision going on, by definition, at least with our taxonomy, it cannot be exceptional. The part I particularly want to pull out for today's presentation, and see if we can't wrap this up soon, is to point out the discrepancy between what supervisees are identifying and what is actually going on, or what kind of supervision they're actually receiving. Heidi, do you want to jump in at this point? I'll let you.
Thanks. You know, I think that for me, this is the most concerning piece of everything, is that we have supervisees who don't know that they're receiving harmful or inadequate supervision. We have supervisors at times that don't know that they're providing that. So there's a lot of room for misinformation. There's a lot of room for kind of failure to educate and inform supervisees. You know, our focus in training is on how to become a therapist, but we don't talk enough about how to become a supervisee and what it means to, you know, take on the role of supervisee. We think about supervision as really being focused on the therapy, which it is, but it's also focused on the supervisee and how the supervisee can make the most out of their supervision experience. So this slide speaks to this idea that we have supervisees who don't know what harmful and inadequate supervision is, and they're endorsing multiple descriptors that are clearly harmful to a bunch of, you know, a panel of experts. And they're saying, yeah, that's not me. Like, all that stuff, I did drugs with my supervisor and I slept together, and this isn't harmful. And so there's a lot of complexity there. We have supervisees in our samples that are saying, I received harmful supervision, facto criteria, and I'm self-identifying my supervision experience as exceptional, wow, profound, significant, all with the same supervisor. So it's very complicated, and I think it also makes sense if we think about it from a trauma-informed lens, right? If you think about kind of what happens when somebody's in a position of authority and power you, and you need to kind of be able to maintain some positive relationship because they have such a strong fiduciary responsibility to you that they're not fulfilling. So you have to be able to find those kind of good parts of the relationship and also almost like squash down any feelings or awareness about the parts that are truly harmful both to you and likely to your clients as well.
The part I would add in here is that the data suggests that supervisors being trained in supervision actually made a difference in terms of fewer percentage of harm. but it did not keep trained supervisors from being harmful to their supervisees. Just another example, and across all 4 studies, and every one of them, at least one supervisee was currently involved in a sexual relationship with their supervisor. And none of them identified that as being harmful. We certainly would. So I briefly want to just talk about this, and the couple things I want to highlight is more of the piece here in terms of the impact of harmful supervision. We have data going back to a study that Dan Unger did that it seems that 5 to 10% of supervisees leave the profession due to harmful supervision. And to me, and for Heidi and I both, it's like, you know, the core of our ethical procedures of our policy is 3 words: do no harm. How can we be doing this to our supervisees, and how can we continue to let it happen? The piece that Heidi was just talking about is what I've been starting to call the supervisee supervision competencies, which pertain to training supervisees how to maximize the use in supervision, how to act in supervision, and also what to look for in terms of inadequate, harmful, and adequate supervision.
Definitely. I hope that this, you know, this webinar can be a starting point to being able to equip yourself with the information and the resources to be able to recognize and potentially respond to harmful and inadequate supervision. So now we'll kind of move on, I believe, to have more of a discussion.
So let me pause for a moment. One thing I would encourage you to do, or invite you to do, I won't encourage unless there is, we did a special issue on narratives of harmful supervision in 2017. That's what's referenced here on the slide, where there are 11 narratives which really bring to light what those numbers I just showed, or we just showed you, were about. When you read those narratives, it's hard to walk away from that without getting a sense of what the impact of harmful supervision really has on supervisees. So I invite you to take a look at those narratives that we presented there. Go ahead, Heidi.
Yes, no, that's a really important point, and those narratives really help to really kind of highlight the lived experiences and really just bring these concepts talking about in somewhat abstract ways to life.
So I think at this point we'll turn it over to the Q&A piece.
Mm-hmm.
Heidi and Mike, thank you so much for your comments, and we have a lot of questions coming in, but I thought what we do is start off the Q&A, just some common questions Jenny and I have, and then we'll start to share some audience questions with you. So for the audience, if you've not done so already, please submit your questions in the Q&A box. So Mike and Heidi, here's a question for you. You shared several examples of inadequate supervision. What are some ways I can monitor the supervisory relationship to be sure I'm not accidentally harming my supervisee? So this is a question about monitoring the relationship.
Mm-hmm. Oh, tag on it. You know, I think the biggest piece as supervisors is to recognize all the power that you have in your role as supervisors. And then of course, you know, our multiple intersecting identities, we might confer additional privilege beyond that, and power beyond that inherent in the supervisory role. So the power differential might be amplified significantly depending on kind of the various identities in the kind of supervisory relationship. I think for me, my biggest, the biggest place to start is by educating yourself. So familiarizing yourself with the literature, the competency benchmarks, the APA guidelines for supervision of health service psychologists, and really to think about how would I know if I was providing inadequate supervision? What cues might I have from my supervisee relationally that let me know that something's awry? And it's very complicated and it's very difficult because we know that there's so many reasons why supervisees will not tell you the supervision you're providing, it's not up to snuff. Where's my supervision contract? Why don't you review my recordings? Why are you not showing up to supervision on time? That's a really, really hard thing for a supervisee to tell their supervisor, even if the relationship, you know, in most contexts is going relatively smoothly. So having supervisor peer support groups where you can kind of hold each other accountable and review each other's practices. You know, for supervisors who haven't received extensive supervision training, being able to seek out that training as continuing education. Being a great clinician is important, but it's not enough for being a competent supervisor. So those are some of the things that I think are really, really important. Mike, what do you think? Do you have any additional ideas about how supervisors can kind of stay accountable?
I mean, I'm guessing with any of the questions that would be posed to us today, we could spend the rest of the time talking about it and going in more depth. I think I would distill it down to 2 or 3 things. One is it's all about the relationship. I think as a supervisor, just reiterating what Heidi was saying, to what extent as a supervisor are you setting the stage in terms of, the way I view it is in terms of cultural humility, that you don't have all the answers and you're inviting the supervisees to be an active collaborator in the supervisory process, that it is not just top down as in terms of how some supervision is delivered. The second thing I think would be really important is to update and think about what I do as a supervisor. As one of the responses in that special issue from Nadine Caslow is that, you know, all of us are capable of being harmful or doing harmful supervision, no matter how much that we've been trained. We get triggered and things can go on where we end up doing something unintentionally that's harmful. Have you set an atmosphere where that supervisees can have permission or feel comfortable enough to actually talk to you about that? So I'd say that's probably the things I would distill it down to at this point.
Yeah, really being able to have a sense of humility, welcome feedback, see that feedback as really a gift because it signifies that the supervisee feels comfortable and safe enough to take that risk with you. I think able to be accountable in those ways and model that is going to lay the groundwork for a strong relationship that can handle, you know, the ebb and flow of various kind of issues or conflict that needs to be worked through.
Thank you for that. And kind of a follow-up on that, from the supervisee's perspective, what are some suggestions you would have for a supervisee if the supervision they're receiving is inadequate or harmful, but they have to stay with their current supervisor? And how would you advise them to explain to potentially future sites or future supervisors why they maybe don't have contact with this person anymore or don't have a letter of recommendation from them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would invite folks to take a look at the article that we did that came out last year by Kangos et al. We talk about applying the standards for the guidelines for clinical supervision for supervisees and what you can do, because we specifically talk about that there. In essence, it comes down to 2 or 3 things. Again, I'm trying to keep our responses short. One is recognize that you don't have the power or authority to actually implement any real change in the clinical supervision relationship with your supervisor. The training director of your program does. So the moment you start thinking, are you getting suspicious that something's not going well, that you're not getting the supervision that you should be getting contractually, you're not meeting with your supervisor for a dedicated 1 hour per week, at least within psychology in the United States, that's the case, then I would encourage you to have a conversation with the training director. First, you might bring it up to the supervisor. And this goes back to the quality of the relationship you have with that supervisor and if you feel safe enough to do that. If you feel safe enough, then ask your supervisors, ask, I really need more supervision. How might we be able to do this? I really need an hour every week to get feedback from you. I need you to monitor my sessions, or think about all those other criteria that go into that inadequate supervision piece. if that is going on, or if there's things going on that are harmful. But the harmful, I'd encourage you to go and talk to your training director. If the training director doesn't feel somebody's safe to you, find a professional that you can talk to. Ideally, it would be somebody who has the authority to actually intervene on your behalf, because again, you don't have that authority to be able to do anything about it. They do. I think
Well, yeah, and I mean, you don't have the, not only are you in a disempowered situation, but there's just so many risks for you speaking up. And many of our supervisee participants, as well as colleagues, as well as myself, it becomes incredibly challenging to say something. And most of us in training don't get to choose our supervisors. And that's a huge difference in terms of post-licensure supervision. Is if something sucks, you just end it, you walk away. You can't do that in a training program, and to the same degree or as easily. So really being able to take control where you can, if you're, if they don't have equipment to record, buy an encrypted recorder, take charge of your supervision that way. I had a really difficult session. I actually got it on recording. Will you look at it with me? Would you be able to do that? But the vast majority of supervisees, the qualitative and quantitative research that we've done, end up seeking out supplemental supervision. And so being able, as Mike said, whether it's a training director, whether it's a trusted mentor, whether it's a staff psychologist who's down the hall at the counseling center that you are doing your internship at, really being able to seek out additional support so that you are still being able to meet your training needs, as well as, meeting your clients' needs, and also being able to have additional people who can speak to your skills and your talents, so that when you're applying to jobs or applying to internship or whatever the next step might be that you're dependent on these supervisors for, you have a wider network and a safety net to buffer against any impact of one supervisor just not showing up for you in the ways that you need.
And I'll just add to build on what Heidi said and tend to the last part of your question, which is where you're mandated to be in the setting with the supervisor has been inadequate or harmful and you can't get out. In that case, your training program and the training director has failed you. Blatantly, that's true. And then the issue is, how do you survive the rest of the time you have there? Finding a supplemental supervisor, finding an advocate for yourself becomes really important, so you know that you're not alone and it's not your fault. And do the best you can to get through it. I might encourage you to document everything in case it turns out around that the supervisor gets vindictive, that you have documentation to back it up.
All right, so move on to an audience question. We're skip around a little bit just so they're relevant to everyone. So what are some suggestions for working with a supervisee who has previously experienced harmful supervision and is now fearful in supervision?
Oh, I've been the supervisor and I've been the supervisee in that context. And I can tell you, following a really harmful supervision experience, my next supervision experience almost was like trauma processing. A lot of working through my concerns, my, the protective guard that I had up, because I didn't feel like I could be my whole self in supervision. And I didn't feel like I could talk about the areas where I was struggling or didn't feel confident about. Living with imposter syndrome is such a real experience for so many of us, most of us, in fact. So I think for those cases, assuming that the supervisor is aware of some of the context around the previous supervision experience, really being able to normalize that. I would not wait for the supervisee to bring that up. I wouldn't wait for the supervisee to bring up anything. It's really on you as a supervisor to initiate those conversations, to talk about how you recognize that people come into supervision as supervisees bringing all of their previous supervision experiences with them. And so, really normalizing that some of those experiences might have been awesome and some experiences you would have preferred not to have endured. And just inviting, I think from the beginning, inviting and approaching the supervisee with a sense of curiosity and understanding your own experiences of difficult supervision that you've had, and inviting them to share with you parts that they feel like might be important for you to be able to best meet their needs in that moment and throughout their training experience together. For me, that was hugely helpful. Really being able to kind of start off by saying, like, I'm a mess, I'm lost, I don't know if I'm good now, I don't know if I'm good at this ever, like I'm really questioning myself. My last experience really messed me up, and us taking a lot of time to work through that, in addition to kind of, working with clients and all of those other pieces, really creating space where we could have a corrective supervision experience in light of the previous experience that I had had.
Yeah, I thought that was excellent, Heidi. I'd add two things to it. One, there's a growing literature out there about trauma-informed supervision. And while bulk of it is geared to working with trauma clients and supervising trainees to how to do that, there are some articles and chapters out there on trauma-informed supervision as it pertains to supervisees and in supervision. So I might encourage you to take a look at that. To me, the real kernel of this is it's all about safety and trust. And like Heidi talked about, I routinely ask my supervisees in the first session, what do we need to do to create a safe and trusting environment here? I specifically and explicitly talk about the power differential and the hierarchical relationship. That's part of the informed consent that I use. Which, by the way, is available in that special issue. There's a template that I developed that you're welcome to take and adapt to your own settings and application if you so choose. But I think that the discussions about safety and trust, and specifically inviting supervisees to give you feedback about what's working and what's not, and to routinely come back to that question. Just don't presume that a supervisee is going to feel safe enough, given the hierarchical structure, that they're going to just ask. I think it's our responsibility to open those doors and to keep peeping into them every once in a while just to find out where things stand and how is the supervision we're doing going for them.
Yeah, I really love that, Mike, because I think that informed consent in therapy and in ongoing, right? It's not something we talk about and check off the list and then move on. So really kind of pausing and checking in and taking the temperature on your relationship, and normalizing, that there's a lot of reasons why supervisees don't disclose, and also that trust in a relationship is earned, and there are really real reasons why supervisees are not going to trust you right away, either because you represent a group that has oppressed them, or you hold this position of power and they've had really serious abuses of power, misuses of power in their past relationships with authority. And so just like I tell my supervisees, like, we expect clients to just spill their guts, but supervision therapy is so strange. I mean, like, you sit with a stranger and you're supposed to tell them everything. Supervision is also strange. The fact that we would expect supervisees to be so open and so vulnerable, it can't be taken for granted or seen as an automatic thing. We really need to put in the time and do the work to earn that.
Thank you. Sometimes sites can be a little overprotective of their supervisee, or like you mentioned before, supervisors may not recognize that they're hitting some of their growth edges. And so how can people who are consulting with supervisees help empower them to speak up, being mindful of all the power dynamics that are there? And also how, as supervisors and as sites, can we be open in a non-defensive way to be receiving feedback from supervisees about harmful or inadequate supervision?
Again, some good questions here. In some ways, I think we partially just addressed that. The parts I might add, because it seems like the shift here is more on the supervisor side. I think it comes down to, I would pull it down to perhaps three things. One is I think in my experience has been those individuals who are most likely to abuse the power are the ones that are least in tune and in touch with the power they actually have. So for me, being a cisgender white male, it means being in touch with what comes with that, with me being in just who I am. When I'm working with somebody who has some different identities than I do, and how do these identities intersect? So I'll start with self-awareness, I think, being really key here. The notion or that construct of cultural humility resonates deeply for me, especially in the context of oppression and privilege. For me to be open to feedback and to be willing to engage in conversations are uncomfortable. One of the things I learned in my internship was, and the supervision I was getting from Dr. Louise Dowse, was that doing the right thing is almost always doing the hard thing. And it was back then I made the decision as a professional, no matter how uncomfortable and how much I may squirm, if it's the right thing to do, what I need to do as a supervisor, I'm going to do it. So engaging on conversations about racial differences with supervisees who are of a different race, or in terms of gender identity or sexual orientation or whatever it might be, to have the courage to actually start those conversations and to recognize that I may engage in a microaggression and invite feedback on it. So one, self-awareness. I think the second part to answer the question is to really be explicitly open about this, to ask the questions, to open those doors, or as Heidi said, check the temperature on a wide variety of things in terms of the process or the interpersonal piece between myself and the supervisee. I think I'll pause there for Heidi, see what else you want to add. I'm just monitoring time. I know there's other questions.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a big Brene Brown fan, and one thing that comes up for me is when a supervisor tells you screwed up, and however indirect, because it likely will be indirect, because it's going to be really hard to say it at all. You know, apologize. Not with a but, not with an explanation, not with some context that might be helpful, not with I was just, but apologize and thank the for the gift that they've given you in taking that risk. So I think being able to figure out within yourself as a supervisor, like, what are your, your touchy points? What do you have trouble with? Are you somebody that has trouble being accountable? Do you rush to defend, like even in your personal life, in your other relationships? How can you if you have a propensity towards shame, and so in that moment you're hearing that you've screwed up and you're going to a really bad just like not nice place with yourself, you have to be able to kind of work through that and practice staying present for your supervisee, reinforcing they shared this feedback with you, and that you welcome that, and that's a gift, and you're going to think about it, and you're sorry, period. I apologize, period. Thank you for letting me know. You might at another point, in another time, you might share some differences that you have, like, well, actually, for me, I want to go back to that conversation we had a couple weeks ago. I've really been thinking about what you said, and I see some parts differently. I was wondering if we could talk about that, because one of the things that we know that happens in supervision is that a supervisee might perceive something as difficult, but also important for their training. And that's not harmful or inadequate supervision. That's difficult feedback that the supervisee needed to be challenged and grow. So there's, it can be messy and complicated in that way. As a supervisee, I think for me, I try to kind of help my supervisees approach from a place of like curiosity, questioning, I'm wondering why we do it this way, or I was just curious how you got to this decision with our clients, or I think can be a way to approach it, while also protecting yourself from any potential negative implications.
Thank you to you both. This might be our last question. This is a question about how diversity and privilege intersect with harmful supervision. And so does the inadequate or harmful supervision disproportionately affect supervisees of minority status, especially since we know 5% of supervisees leave the field? And how can we improve cultural humility in this area?
Want to go first on this one, Heidi? Doesn't matter. We just need to be short.
Yeah. So I don't know that we have any stats that suggest that harmful and inadequate supervision proportionately impacts minority supervisees. And I think that our research is very limited in terms of capitalizing or being inclusive and appreciating intersectionality. But I would say that any ways in which the power dynamic is amplified have, for example, and this is changing now as the field is more diverse and more diverse in terms of supervisors who are entering the field as supervisors, but a more kind of classic arrangement was a white male supervisor with a female supervisor of color, for example. And that's what a lot of the literature on quote unquote cross-cultural, cross-racial, multicultural supervision, like all of that, the undercurrent seems to be that piece, like where the supervisor holds racial privilege, gender privilege, cis privilege, and the supervisee, is a member of marginalized groups. I think that it definitely makes supervisee more vulnerable to those abuses of power. I think that they, thinking about how one's experiences of other sources of trauma, whether that's ancestral trauma, racial trauma, etc., enter into the supervisee relationship, and also, kind of accumulate of additional traumas experienced in training. I think that there's definitely a lot more research that needs to be done in this area in terms of kind of how to respond. And I think this is where my hope is that supervisees have at least one person that they can be their whole selves with and feel confide in what's going on, so that somebody can really start from the place of legitimizing their sense of reality and finding ways that they can protect themselves while also getting their training needs addressed. So I'm not sure I answered fully the question, but those are some of the thoughts that come to mind for me.
Yeah, just briefly, to the extent there's data, and I'll use that in quotes, is when we were pulling together the narratives of harmful supervision special issue, we sent out an invite broadly across listservs, across disciplines, across countries, as much as we could. Of the 115 responses we got back, we asked them to give a brief description of who they were and what their harmful experience was. My recollection was somewhere between a half and 2/3 of those individuals identified identity issues of being at play within those harmful experiences. In terms of the 11 narratives in the special issue, I think more than half cover where identity issues come into play or the intersecting identities. It's the best data I've got. For time's sake, I don't have more to add to what Heidi said, so I'll stop there.
Thank you both. We are out of time for today, and thank everyone for submitting questions, and wish we had more time to get to them all. But thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Drs. Ellis and Hutman for sharing your wisdom and experiences and making this webinar a success. If you would like to be part of a community of folks committed to clinical supervision and training, please consider joining our section, the section on supervision and training. We are putting the links to our website and membership application in the chat. Membership is free and gives you access to a multitude of wonderful resources and opportunities, including our listserv, where you can ask any questions that weren't answered during this webinar. So sign up and don't miss out. So thank you all again, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.
If I could put one plug in, Jenny, as the International Interdisciplinary Conference on Clinical Supervision is going to be July 29th through 31st. I certainly invite you to take at least a look at the webpage there. Invite you to come to that conference. If you're passionate about supervision, you want to learn about it, that's where you find a lot of the experts there presenting. Great conference. Come join us.
Yeah, and And a lot of the topics that we're speaking to, trauma-informed supervision, racial trauma and supervision, are kind of being presented there. So we hope to thank you so much to you both and to the section and the Practice Advisory Board for inviting us to do this.
Thank you. A privilege and an honor to be able to do this today.
I'm going to put the link to the conference also in the chat if anyone is interested in signing up. So thank you, everyone.